Connectivity represents a response to the threats that we used to call fragmentation, or that used to be the major threat, fragmentation of habitats. Fragmentation of habitats appeared as natural resources exploitation increased. It turned large areas populated by dynamic and dispersing populations that occupied wide areas that was necessary for their survival, because they're migrating or because of their mating system, the way they reproduce requires exchange on large populations. Exploitation of resources has fragmented these areas. It's removed part of this area and separated or removed access and exchange of individuals between what was in the past one big population. So now the habitat's fragmented, the individuals cannot exchange with each other, and they cannot use the whole resources that they need to survive. I'm thinking of elephants that need to move on huge areas. Fragmentation would come as urbanization or development of transport infrastructure that would cut them off from part of their territory, which would reduce their capacity to feed and then to breed.
Looking at the whole of the landscape and how you can connect up protected areas so that species can move between different areas where they're wide-ranging species, and even quite narrow areas between foraging and breeding areas, and also linking up ecological processes as well, so that the ecosystems can work effectively, often to the benefit of human beings, because of course we obtain all sorts of services from the environment: clean air, food, clean water, pollination. All of these are services that the environment provides us with, and connectivity plays an important part in delivering those areas. So it's moving beyond protected areas to look at the whole landscape and to try and get conservation across the landscape.
So connectivity is about the retention, or the recognition, I should say, that these islands of protected areas do need to be interconnected, but as much as possible by natural habitat. Connectivity conservation is the conservation of that connectivity. And that connectivity scientists recognise in 4 different forms. One is about landscape connectivity, and that may or may not be of benefit to species, but for the human eye, it's a continuous vista of natural or semi-natural lands, which is very pleasant and important to people. People want to live in places like this. Habitat conservation, connectivity conservation, relates to the retention of critical habitat. For example, a bird may need particular trees at certain intervals or certain spacing to move along north-south gradient in terms of their flyways. There's the ecological ecosystem services, ecosystem connectivity considerations as well. For example, where the bird, let's go with another rainforest bird, with its seeds it's just eaten on one particular rainforest tree, eats that seed, flies down the forest and deposits it in another location. There's a connectivity link between the animal, the bird, and the future of the forest. And then finally, there's the evolutionary aspects of connectivity, where this movement along a corridor can actually mean the interaction of species, and as pressures are on those individual species, that interaction can actually lead to evolutionary traits or developments that assist with the long-term conservation of those species.
The Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, also known as Y2Y, was founded about 20 years ago. And it evolved out of our understanding about how large mammals use the landscape, that they need not only large areas of intact habitat, but they need to be able to move between those areas of habitat. And so the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative is taking that thinking that we need to allow animals to move between protected areas, and we've applied it to a very large scale, to a continental scale, literally 3,200 kilometers from the south end of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem to almost to the Arctic Circle in the Yukon. One of the great inspirations for the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative was the journey of a wolf called Pluie. Pluie was radio collared near here in southern Alberta in the early 1990s. She covered an area of more than 40,000 square miles, and that was one of the findings that led the founders of Yellowstone to Yukon to realize that we needed to think about wildlife conservation at such a large scale, much, much larger than our current parks and protected areas system. The regimes of different jurisdictions can be a real challenge to wildlife conservation. Different jurisdictions might have different policies that are contradictory or not complementary to each other. And what the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative tries to illustrate is that when we are thinking about conservation at a large scale, we need different jurisdictions to work together. We need them to think about aligning their policies so that a wolf like Pluie, who was protected when she was traveling around in the US, doesn't step across into Canada where she was in fact unprotected and she was legally killed.
Some countries, such as the US, have tried to facilitate a process by which they've drafted dedicated legislation. So they tried to draft a law such as the Wildlife Conservation Corridors Bill. I think it was in about 2003. And that never came to fruition. So other countries have also tried to adopt dedicated legislation. So we've seen in South Korea there's a dedicated law in the context, I think it's called the Mount Daegu Mountain Systems Act, which is a whole dedicated law which promotes connectivity in that mountain system. But that's by far the exception, and most countries are sitting in a situation where there's no dedicated connectivity legislation. But that doesn't mean that connectivity cannot be achieved through the law, because if one looks across many different sectoral laws, you'll find embedded in those particular laws particular legal tools which could be used to promote connectivity conservation.
It's a really interesting area in terms of law, because there's lots of different types of law involved. We talk about environmental law, but there are lots of more familiar areas of law to people, perhaps.
There's not like one law. It's a question of a team or menu of laws to help in certain situations, and you apply those laws as in tools for different types of jurisdictions. So for private lands, it will be generally some kind of real estate or transactional law. For public lands, it might be some kind of advocacy law, but that continuum or breadth of law is used to help develop some kind of complementary, comprehensive conservation. And so you use the right law for the right circumstance.
Well, connectivity, you'd have the environmental scientific approach to it, and you'd have the land use, planning, legal side to it, in terms of making decision on how to attribute resources, prioritize exploitation of a region, how to distribute infrastructure. Connectivity of protected area is a guidance for government to understand in their national accounting what is the value, the exact value that they are attributing, for instance, to mining or to infrastructure. A quick box on mining might actually represent a huge loss for an enormous population over 200 years that would have lived off the resources that are gone as a byproduct of mining, for instance, water, timber, forest. Land use planning and land use management as a legal framework is a guidance for countries to decide where the resources should be allocated.
There is regulatory law, and that certainly is I'd say an enforcement approach to a lot of private land conservation. But then there's this whole new field of conservation easement law and incentives, finance incentives that deals with the tax code, which is actually saving more private lands than anyone ever even thought about, just because of the incentive system for people to protect their lands and get some kind of tax benefit or benefit when they transfer that legacy to their children or grandchildren is a new and exciting field of law. A lot of these private large land holdings run at the economic margins, and the people who are the stewards of these lands, or ranchers or timber folk, they can't afford, because of certain tax laws, whether it's estate laws or property tax laws, to pass that legacy on to their children. And a lot of times those lands become subdivided and fragmented, which is what we don't want for ecological integrity. So by having folks look at these incentive-based conservation easement laws, they're able to maintain the legacy of these landscapes in terms of the ecology without fragmenting them, but also being able to pass them on to future generations. And a lot of these lands have in perpetuity conservation easements, so they can never be subdivided, and conservation is going to be first and foremost in their protection.
The approaches are so different in different countries. In some countries there are constitutional restrictions on regulating private landholders, so there's really interesting legal questions, and there's a massive challenge. There's a massive challenge to move away from protected areas, especially protected areas under government control, which has been the traditional approach, at least in Australia, in America, and I think in Canada, where you have these big areas of government land set aside for conservation, and trying to get conservation across the landscape. And of course, in a context of climate change, this is absolutely essential.